Cornell Dupree never thought a simple morning on his lake would turn into a public humiliation that would burn into his memory. He had woken with the kind of peace only the land could give him. The wide Texas sky stretched overhead, the quiet water shimmering, and the rhythm of pushing his old flat bottom boat out into the shallows. That lake had been his refuge for years. It sat squarely on his deed, a piece of property he had worked for, paid taxes on, and walked like it was an extension of his own body. But the peace broke when the sound of sirens cut across the still air. At first, he thought maybe it was traffic out on the highway, but then the red and blue lights flashed across the water, and the pit in his stomach told him the truth: they were coming for him. Deputies stepped out of their patrol cars near the subdivision marina, and with them came a cluster of neighbors, whispering, filming, waiting to watch a spectacle. In front of them all stood Janice Kettering, the Homeowners Association president, holding her clipboard like a weapon, her chin tilted high, as if she owned the lake itself. Cornell's boat rocked under him as he heard the deputy call out for him to come to shore. He rowed back, steady on the outside, though his insides boiled with disbelief. When they asked for his ID, he handed it over, knowing eyes were burning holes in his back, cameras capturing every second. Janice's voice carried sharp over the water. That lake belongs to the subdivision. You can't just use it like you own the place. Cornell raised his head and fired back with calm steel. It's on my deed. My ranch line runs straight through here. The deputies flipped through his papers, eventually conceding that he was within his rights. But the damage was done. In front of half the neighborhood, Cornell Dupree had been treated like a trespasser on his own land. He had been forced to justify his ownership, to defend himself as if he were some intruder caught breaking into someone else's home. The crowd murmured, their whispers cutting deeper than any fine or citation could. He walked back to his boat, hands trembling, not with fear, but with the humiliation of being reduced to a man who had to prove his belonging in a place he had blood, sweated, and paid for. The lake, once his peace, had turned into a stage where his dignity was dragged through the mud. And while the deputies left and the neighbors drifted back to their homes, Cornell knew something had shifted. That moment wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a wound. And a wound like that demanded an answer. Cornell Dupree did not answer Janice Kettering with shouting or lawsuits. That wasn't his way. Instead, he carried the weight of that humiliation home and let it sit inside him until it hardened into resolve. He had spent his life working the ranch, building fences, hauling hay, and paying every tax bill the county ever set in front of him. He understood something most of his neighbors didn't. Real strength doesn't always come loud, it comes quiet, through patience, through persistence. And so, while the HOA president strutted around with her clipboard, acting like she owned the lake, Cornell went looking for the truth. It came to him like a whisper in the feed store. Two men talking, casual as anything, mentioned that the subdivision Marina wasn't actually owned by the HOA at all. It was leased. The words hit Cornell like a nail driven into oak. The crown jewel of the neighborhood, the place Janice ruled over like a queen, wasn't even theirs. They were borrowing power, renting authority, building their throne on someone else's ground. Cornell didn't show his reaction. He kept his head down, loaded his grain, and drove home with the thoughts circling his mind like buzzards over roadkill. That night he sat at his kitchen table with a notepad. He wrote down one word: Marina, then underlined it twice. Ownership, financing, repairs, leverage. It all spilled from his pen in neat, careful strokes. This wasn't revenge, this was strategy. If the HOA didn't own the Marina, then whoever did held the leash around their neck. And if Cornell became that man, then the same people who had tried to strip him of his dignity would have to come knocking at his door. The next morning, he drove to the county clerk's office. Rows of filing cabinets, the smell of dust and paper, the quiet shuffle of shoes against linoleum. It was a place where truths were stored in ink and deed, not gossip and rumor. Cornell asked for the records, and the clerk pulled a file. The name was Raymond Lockhart, a man out of Gainesville. Taxes late, docks in disrepair, ownership steady but wary. Cornell held the paper in his hand and saw what no one else did: a door opening. That evening, over sweet tea, he told Sharon what he had learned. Her eyes narrowed, knowing her husband's mind was already miles down a road most wouldn't dare to walk. She didn't stop him, though. She never had. She only said, "Do it smart." And so he did. With the help of an old real estate friend, Cornell arranged a meeting with Lockhart. The man was tired, worn down by years of patchwork repairs and dwindling returns. He saw the Marina as a burden, an anchor pulling him into debt. Cornell saw it as something else entirely: leverage, the kind that could flip a world upside down without raising a single voice. Sitting on Lockhart's porch, Cornell made his pitch. No smooth words, no polished smile, just truth. He wanted the marina, not for condos, not for development, but for the simple principle of owning what others had tried to use against him. Lockhart studied him with the eyes of a man who had seen buyers come and go, each with their schemes and empty promises. But Cornell wasn't like them. He was steady, his voice calm, his reason clear. By the time they shook hands, the deal was set. 30 days, financing secured, and the marina would belong to Cornell Dupree. No shouting, no confrontation, no threats. Just the quiet power of a man turning humiliation into strategy. The HOA had called the law on him, tried to write him out of his own lake. Now he was about to buy the very dock they depended on, and when the ink dried, the balance of power would no longer be theirs. It would be his. When word spread that Cornell Dupree now owned the marina, the neighborhood didn't know what to make of it. Some folks laughed at first, brushing it off as a rancher's vanity project, a man throwing his money into a pit just to make a point. Others bristled, whispering that he had stolen something sacred from the community, that he meant to choke them with new rules and fees. And at the center of that storm stood Janice Kettering, clipboard in hand, rallying her circle like a general whose fortress had just been breached. She told anyone who'd listen that Cornell was dangerous, that he would gut the subdivision and bleed its residents dry. She staged protests by the gates of the marina, neighbors holding signs that read, "Save our dock," and "Stop the Dupree takeover." Cornell said nothing. He let them shout. He let them wave their signs. He let Janice spit her venom in newsletters and community meetings. Because while she barked, he worked. Quietly, methodically. He brought in a crew to repair the rotting pilings, to mend the warped boards where children had tripped, to replace rusted chains and broken lights. For years the HOA had lectured about improvements, passing the blame from one committee to the next, but nothing ever got done. Now under Cornell's hand, the marina began to shine again. The lease term stayed the same. No hikes, no tricks. Residents could dock their boats, fish, picnic, and swim just as before. But this time, when they came down to the water, they found a place safer, cleaner, and stronger than it had been in years. Slowly, whispers shifted. Neighbors who had cursed his name now nodded in quiet acknowledgement when they saw him walking the planks, checking the bolts himself, hat pulled low against the sun. Respect didn't come in an avalanche. It trickled like rain through cracks in dry soil. A father who had once signed Janice's petition now shook Cornell's hand, thanking him for fixing the dock where his daughter had cut her foot last summer. A group of teenagers started calling him Mr. D. When they spotted him near the marina, their laughter carrying more warmth than mockery. Even the older couples, long accustomed to HOA speeches and broken promises, began to see in Cornell not a villain, but a man who did what needed to be done without asking for applause. Janice raged harder with every shift in the wind. She wrote angry letters, demanded audits, tried to twist fear back into the community's bones. But the louder she got, the smaller she seemed. People compared her noise to Cornell's silence, her threats to his actions, and one by one, they chose him. Not because he promised them power or money or special favor, but because he showed them something they hadn't seen in years, a leader who kept his word. By the time the protests thinned out and the signs were left to rot in garages, Cornell Dupree no longer stood as the man who had been humiliated on his own lake. He had become the man who turned humiliation into purpose, who built respect not with speeches, but with nails, sweat, and steady hands. The same neighbors who once watched him be questioned like a trespasser now looked to him as the man who had restored the very heart of their community. In the end, it was never about the marina. Not really. It wasn't about owning docks or leasing slips or even holding the HOA by its throat. For Cornell Dupree, it had always been about something quieter, something deeper. The dignity that had been stripped from him that day on his own lake, when the flashing lights painted him like a criminal in front of his neighbors. The memory of Janice's voice, sharp and triumphant, had cut into him like a blade, and no amount of paper or signatures could stitch that wound shut. What healed it was the way he chose to fight back. Cornell could have gone to war the easy way. He could have yelled, threatened lawsuits, dragged the HOA through the mud in the county courthouse. But men like Cornell knew that shouting fades, and lawsuits only feed lawyers. What lasts is the work you do with your hands, the promises you keep, the way you carry yourself when others want you on your knees. So he stayed steady. He bought the marina, not to gloat, not to destroy, but to show that a man's respect is not something you give or take away with a vote. It is earned, protected, and reclaimed when necessary. When folks walked the repaired planks or tied their boats to the strong, new cleats, they weren't just seeing improvements. They were seeing a truth. They saw that Cornell had been right all along, that the lake and the land tied to his name weren't privileges handed down by some HOA decree, but hard-earned rights bound up in the sweat of his work and the ink of his deed. They saw a man who could have broken them with greed, but instead chose to lift the community higher than it had stood in years. Even those who never spoke it out loud felt the shift. Respect, once denied, had returned to Cornell like a tide creeping back over the shore. And Janice, her voice, once the loudest in the neighborhood, now echoed hollow, each accusation falling flat against the simple fact that Cornell had done what she never could. The lesson lingered in the air long after the shouting stopped. Strength isn't loud. It doesn't need flashing lights or the approval of a crowd. It doesn't live in titles, clipboards, or bylaws. Strength is the man who swallows humiliation without breaking, who waits, who works, who reclaims what is his with quiet persistence. Cornell Dupree proved that revenge is small, but dignity is everything.